Hello, many thanks for joining us here on GBC News Channel. My name is Abdul Hayi Moomen, and this is Moomen Tonight. And on our show tonight, we focus on the media industry. Not the usual conversation about framing of stories and of agenda setting and so on, but we're looking at the very survival of the media in the face of these challenges from technology. Well, should I even call them challenges? Has technology come to complement the work of media or to take away the work that traditional media has been doing over the years? These and many more are the questions we seek answers for as we engage the very right person to engage in such a conversation with tonight. He is the CEO of the ABN Holdings Limited, and they are into media, and they have also been researching on media across the Sub Saharan Africa. And he is in the person of Mr. George Chumesi. Mr. Chumesi, thank you very much for accepting to speak with us here on GBC News.
Thank you for having me on your program.
So you are a Ghanaian, but obviously you haven't been residing in Ghana. Tell me, for how long have you been away from home?
I finished NAFTI in 1983. And when I did, I wanted to produce Anansi stories with a friend of mine to translate Anansi stories essentially into like the equivalent of Mickey Mouse. And that took me off to, got me off to England. And I ended up working for a company which produced animated television content for Central Television, part of the ITV group. And in the course of time, during my quest to produce this series, I found out that markets do matter, and that African content did not yet have a market in the Western world. So it came upon me that there was a need for an African broadcast network, and that has been driving me in and out of the country for the past 34 years.
Okay, so you just made a very interesting point, that there is no African broadcasting network.
Yes.
We used to have UTNA. Then Africa used to have, or currently has, the AUB, yes, which coordinates most of the continental events that need broadcasting and so on. That contradicts your statement.
UTNA, in its definition, in essence, is an organization of broadcasters within the context of public service broadcasting, but in reality, state-controlled broadcasters after Africa. It originated when the first television signal, which came out of Ibadan, right, was kind of like initiated. So UTNA is a creation of very perceptive Nigerians during the early 60s. It's the Union of National Radio and Television Associations of Africa at the time of its existence. Over the course of time, UTNA became the representative entity for sports rights within like football, FIFA football, and other related games such as the Olympic Games. So for many years, its enduring mainstay was football. And then in 2006, the need to recalibrate itself ensued in the creation of the African Union of Broadcasting. And the need at the time was driven by the ITU agreements in the same year to ensure that by 2015, 7th June 2015 or 15th June 2015, African broadcasters would have switched from analog to digital, analog to digital infrastructure. Obviously, there have been impediments, and as an entity, it's had significant challenges. So the African Broadcast Network, the differentiator of the two, the African Broadcast Network, is its vision and intent is to create a soft power that speaks to the African imagination, which inspires the African mind, and which projects a new positive Africa at peace with itself and inspired to bring about change within itself.
Is there any similar organization anywhere in the world? Maybe do we have a European broadcast network or a South American broadcast network. Is there any similar thing across the world?
You've got, China has its own soft power. The BBC is the soft power of the United Kingdom. CNN is a commercial entity, but it projects American values. You've got RT, and you've got the Russian France television, the French TV network, France 24, right? Africa has a peculiar set of contexts that you cannot ignore. In 1884, with the partition of Africa, right, nation states were formed or developed, right, on artificial lines, not on ethnocentric lines. So in our time, you can see across the continent the different types of ethnic conflicts that have ensued, right? Not based on economic reality, but on cultural challenges that have endured during the time of the colonial process we have been through. So there's a need for regional integration. So to answer your question, an African broadcast network is not generic in its context, but it's an affiliation, a commercial affiliation of television in the public sector and private sector space to reconfigure a new way of generating African content made by Africans for Africans, to reconfigure a new way of utilizing resources to ensure that there's economies of scale, and to define new revenue models that will ensure that every region can produce content which speaks to its peoples.
You made a profound statement that Africa, I mean the entire world, was supposed to have migrated onto the digital platform by June 2015.
Africa specifically.
Africa. And yet we're in 2019 and the story is not an exciting one. And that brings me to my question. Perhaps Africa is not ready for digitization, given all the problems we have. You said due to some challenges, we haven't been able to migrate fully. And I say, yes, that's true. We have power crisis, we have money issues. The economies of African countries are not as strong as they should be, and so on. And so in the face of all these challenges, probably digitization is not the way to go.
You could make that argument, but the forensic reality is that the world has moved on. We have the new information superhighway. The internet is an utility that has come to stay. So it's not whether or not we remain in the analog stratosphere of thoughts. The reality is that manufacturers of equipment, or OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, have now moved. So if you've got analog infrastructure, it breaks down, you're not going to get the spare parts from an engineering perspective. Signals have now been digitized, right? And what it's created is a new spectrum which allows for new types of content to be produced, new revenue models to be generated online, which is kind of like basically non-linear broadcasting or television, and linear, which is live television. If Africa does not come along in that revolution, television will end up just as most nations have found themselves without airlines, without railway networks, without effective energy infrastructure. Right, that's going to happen because the digital reality is that it's creating a new economy, right? And that economy is powering new transformative revenue models all over the world.
So I have heard arguments from traditional media practitioners that technology, digitization and so on is a threat to the media, not just media practice, but the media industry in Africa. You have presented a picture that says we need to live along with the times, but the reality is that it is a threat to media.
That is possibly true, depends on which side of the aisle of thoughts you dwell. But let's look at analog in its own essence, right? Analog allows limited broadcasting, right? So you have the difference between a digital system and an analog system. It's like you have the shower in your bathroom. It's the shower and the tap in your kitchen.
Yeah.
If you open the tap, you've got one flow. If you open the shower, you've got different sprockets and different flows. In the digital age, the shower, each sprocket represents a channel. So you can give more services, much more diversity, and engage civil society, right? And different interventions, which the analog era cannot and does not allow. That's number one. Secondly, the digital system, many have defined the process of the digital switchover as DTT.
Yes.
Digital terrestrial television. That is not the proper definition. The proper definition is a digital ecosystem, right? A digital ecosystem means that you look at video gaming, right? You look at government services, you look at long distance learning, you look at access to information, and then you look at entertainment within the context of content placements, product placements, and also the variety of the ethnocentric configuration of every society, whereby you can create narrow-casted contents for a particular type of people to generate a specific revenue source. So when you weigh the two sets of arguments, right, one is omnidirectional, the other is unidirectional. It's a choice. It's a choice that every nation can make. But the reality is that most people right now, as broadband access increases, and it will, within 5 years from now, as smartphones become more affordable, right, and the terrestrial networks, the last mile, fiber optics, in terms of getting into homes here, becomes more and more cost effective, right? Many Africans, the African continent is a young one. 70% of Africans are under the age of 30, right? They want to consume content on their terms. And it's not sitting in the living room with their parents. People have tablets, people have smartphones, and incrementally there'll be more in the market. There'll be cheaper access to broadband. What it means is that if you don't give the consumer the choice that they want, they'll go to other sources and other platforms.
You see, again, talking about technology vis-a-vis the media industry, there is that fear. And you began this conversation by telling us your initial ideas of bringing Anansi, you know, in the African sense to the African audience and so on. Yes, the truth is that in reality, if you ask any African child today to draw Spider-Man, they will not draw Anansi. They'll give you the American version of Spider-Man because it's a Spider-Man they have been exposed to on TV and on the internet. The more we are exposed to technology, the more exposed we will be to foreign content as against local content, because still we lack the capacity to produce local TV stations. So many of them, you refer to the shower and the tap issue. So we have so many avenues to broadcast content now. But what do we end up doing? We show soap operas from Mexico, from India, and from other parts of the world. Invariably, we are teaching our people other cultures other than ours, and that is the disadvantage that I was trying to point out to you.
Yes, but I tend to look at the glass which is half full, not the half empty syndrome, and I'll explain. The digital revolution, as we speak, will move into the quantum revolution within the next 10 years. Right now, most Africans, in terms of consumption of data, right, are limited by 2G exposure, which does texted voice. Incrementally, 3G, 4G, and then 5G. By the way, all these are definitions of different levels of cellular technology.
Yes.
Right, that's evolving. The cost of each one of these, right, relates to the capital intensive nature of putting data servers, etc. in place. Mobile operators who have experienced this phenomenal growth in voice technology, right, are now being forced by companies like Amazon, right, etc., to look at new forms of technology. So we live in a data-hungry society right now. What is going to ensue in terms of meeting P&L expectations of shareholders is that a digital content revolution, which has exploded around the world, right, is going to happen in Africa, and it's going to be the young, the vibrant, the forward-looking, right, the new digi-entrepreneur, right, who's going to benefit. So it depends. You can look at opportunity and you can look at limitation. I choose to look at opportunity, right? I choose to look at opportunity because according to PwC, McKinsey's, right, Accenture, and other management consulting companies that have done research, empirical research, right, in this space, right, have attested to the reality that by 2025, you have a 300 billion per annum IGDP across this continent, right? That 300 billion ecosystem, right, would have 75 billion per annum of that in the sphere of e-commerce. And that's where rich media comes in, right, in relation to data. So there's an ensuing reality of three things. Number one, a very strong desire for Afrocentricity and cultural emancipation. Number two, a very strong desire to create and forge a new creative economy, which is three, driven by awesome revenues, driven by algorithms, which has never happened before in terms of programmatics, right? So these realities, they're already happening. That's why you've got Facebook as a powerhouse, right? The biggest editorially independent platform in the world. That is why in the US markets, right, Washington Post is owned by Amazon and New York Times is struggling. That's why there's Huffington Post, and you've got this other new company, right, whose name has just escaped me, right, but basically BuzzFeed, right, evolving new models incrementally. So if you look at newspapers around the world, let's say The Independent or The Guardian, they have a video component. You see the clips on WhatsApp all around. So the ecosystem that existed for the traditional print media and news media and television as it is today in Ghana and across Africa is obsolete, right? That's what it is.
I understand you, but still, forgive me if I'm going back to the same point over and over again. Still, the danger there, which we should not run away from, is that at the end of the day, because of the powerful nature of the media, what technology will end up doing to Africa is that the Africans will be sold European and American ideas, and then Africans will forget what it means to be African.
That is called sociological mobility. That's how empires are built here, and people are conquered, cultural imperialism. But let's pause, let's not get philosophical, yeah? Or let me not get philosophical, let me pause. If you're a businessman, you want to make money, but there's something called public interest media. So let's not look at technology. Technology is simply an enabler, right? So technology should be put within the context of its enabling quantum propensity. Number one, what we've got to look at is the power and value of local content. Where is our local content industry? One sphere, one genre of content that has taken over, right, in terms of the African viewership is Nollywood content. Recently, there's something called Wakaliwood, which is crazily phenomenal from Uganda, right? And you've got Riverwood, I think Riverwood, and you've got other woods, Ghana's
Gollywood.
Yeah, you've got all of these, yeah. Are they producing documentaries about the great rivers of Africa? Are they producing documentaries about the great mountains? Do we know our country? As Ghanaians, people from the north know very little about people from the east. Do we really know and understand our culture? We have an opportunity, therefore, right, to utilize the technologies to create new revenue models, which allows us to produce content that now allows us to break down fossils of barriers which currently exist. And television, as you know, is not limited to entertainment alone. You've got news contents, you've got documentaries, you've got sports, you've got religious programs, you've got other sorts of. So this opportunity to create dynamic, engaging, and vibrant television should be perceived, right, as the substratum for the new evolution of digital technologies, not the other way around.
I was at a conference recently, and indeed, by myself, I've also been reading documents on the survival of the media industry in Africa in particular. And I can tell you that many of the media owners in Ghana that I know of have a certain fear that over a period of time, they have begun to lose revenue. And once the media industry loses revenue, what it means is that you're going to lay off workers. What it means is that the quality, if it's a print house, the quality of the print is going to go down. The number of newspapers perhaps you print on a daily basis will reduce. Technology has affected the print industry. Technology, even though should be enhancing TV and radio work, has affected TV in particular because, again, the spectrum has been opened up. Many of the persons and institutions that used to advertise in the past now have access to their own broadcast platforms. Facebook is one of them, YouTube is one of them, and then traditional TV and radio is also out there, and therefore the traditionally known media houses are beginning to suffer and to suffocate.
Okay, so look at the 20 most powerful companies in the world, right? The top 20 companies, they're less than 30 years old, right? A few of them have quotes in terms of their value of over $1 trillion, right? The world's most valuable companies, Amazon and Apple included, have changed the way we live. So technology is a reality that has come to stay. There's a paradigm shift. So those nations or those responsible state organs who do not embrace the reality of that seismic shift, will end up within 10 years from now, I promise you, with moribund entities that generate no revenue. I promise you, because technology is moving. It's not waiting for you and I. It's just moving, right? And we're just consumers of new formats. When I was growing up, there were no mobile phones. There wasn't the internet, right? There was no email system. The pen pals, you did the pen pal airmail. Sadly, I remember the first day in my life when I used the phenomena of attaching a document to an email. It didn't make sense to me. Because I was used to the fax machine, feeding one page at a time. And I didn't have to do that anymore. I could just attach a document, off it goes, seconds it's happened, right? I had to generate a certain level of activated knowledge, right, and continue in that in order to embrace the new technologies. I had to read up. So Peter Drucker, who is a writer of business here, talks about entrepreneurship, right, and technology, and says when technology happens, it takes 20 years for people to adapt, right? I hope that we don't have 20 years to adapt. If those who are visionary, right, can capture the essence of now, the now, right, there will be new leaders in this market. Second reality is that everywhere in the world, convergence is happening, where print and television and radio are converging into conglomerates and consortiums, where infrastructure, governing regulatory and policy systems are being forced to change, right? Where antitrust laws are being ignored because there's no solution. I mean, who is regulating Facebook, for example? Recently, last week or so, I saw this thing on CNN where Mark Zuckerberg was being interviewed by Congress, right? And the reality is that he holds the chips, he holds the cards because he's got a group of young techies who are changing the world. And that change is subject to flaws, right? Roadblocks and a lot of bumps, but it's happening nonetheless, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you look at our ecosystem here in Ghana, there's a huge opportunity to look at things forensically and create a converged environment. One, if you're a media owner and you don't have revenues to govern your P&L, to ensure that your company is evolving, at some point you're going to close down shop. Close shop.
I ahead of this interview, I was reading about the ABN Holdings Limited, and one of the things I realized, and I just have to read this out, it says that you are focusing on revolutionizing commercial and public service, free-to-air broadcasting across Sub Saharan Africa. I'm saying this is huge. How do you intend to do this?
I've been working on this for 30 years, right? When I had a lecturer, I had good teachers at NAFTI. When I went to NAFTI, the Frederick Ebert Foundation was very active in its development, and I had the good fortune of having a mentor called Reinhard Mickey, German, who's buried here in Ghana. And I wrote my dissertation in terms of my final paper, and it was enlightenment through entertainment. And he put me aside and said that would be possibly one of the most significant contributions, right, to Africa's development. And I took that on, and I started engaging myself year after year after year. And now, where I am at is that I am focused on public interest media. And public interest media, by definition, is how do you create a fourth estate to enhance social development, economic emancipation, right? Political reconstruction in terms of the democratic process, right? And what public interest media is supposed to do is supposed to help enlighten the mind. And in the case of my configuration of thoughts, I defer or refer to Bob Marley's statement, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, for none other than ourselves can free our minds. Right, redemption song. And the way you do that is through the power of the television. The television is a miraculous, powerful reality. I mean, look at television, we take it for granted, but it is phenomenal, right? And when you look at the images, I believe that we need to understand our culture. We need to engage in the curriculum that kind of basically starts across schools about who we are as a people. We need a new African personality. A confident, vibrant young African who believes that their mind works, who can contribute not just to the national ecosystem, but the cause of Afrocentricity. And by extension, one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest continents in the world, a new form of wealth creation, right, which will ensue simply by seeing positive images of oneself, projected images of the future, which colors us as beautiful people, people whose culture is rich, and people whose lands are blessed.
Unfortunately, in an era where there is no regulation, and you cited the Facebook example, people do things at will. And so in the era of technology, any individual can have a YouTube channel, broadcast his or her content, regardless of how useful that content may be, regardless of how damaging that content may be. You have talked about how powerful TV is. And yes, basically that's TV. Nobody says to watch TV for 3 hours any longer. People watch on their phones, on their tablets, on their laptops, on the move, and so on. And so we will be exposed to all sort of weird ideas that will contradict the beautiful scenes that you've drawn for us right now, the beautiful rivers, the culture of the people, and so on. People are showing nudity, and that has become the order of the day. They trend because they showed us nude videos and nude pictures.
The trend is saying that when vacuum, nature abhors vacuum, right? Creativity is an industry. But I don't need to, I mean, you know the industry, I don't have to go on and on. But let's look at the cold light facts of the day. Digital content publishing today is trillions of dollars, right? It's an industry. There is room for African content to be developed. When you go to Selfridges in London, sometimes pubs in Mayfair, sometimes other places where people who are served are not African, you hear hip life being played. because it's funky music, right? I believe that a time will come when you do Yasan's Wars, Queen Amina of Zaria, King Jaja of Opobo, yeah, the Ashantis, the Dagombes, the Gas, who we were, the Fulanis, yeah, Mansa Musa, you name it, yeah, Askia Mohammed. I believe that we can create Oscar-winning movies. We can create television series, right? That's as good as any in the world, because we have a very rich deposit of oral traditions and culture. We just need visionaries. We need people who break the mold. When you're breaking the mold, you get a lot of people who basically do not want you to. Change is painful, but it's those individuals who step forward, who change the world. And I believe that we live in a time and in a generation, I've seen it, in this country, there are geniuses, young, talented people, right? And my life is to champion, right, change in this system, right, to bring about enlightenment across Africa through entertainment.
Right. Right, this is Moomen Tonight. If you just joined us, we're speaking with the CEO of the ABN Holdings Limited, Mr. George Chumesi, who has been sharing ideas with us as to how the media industry in Africa can be remodeled to match up with the demands of the time in the face of technology, how the media industry can take advantage of technology to grow. And just before we went for the break, I was about to talk to you about the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation in particular. That's the state-owned broadcaster in Ghana. Yet, in the over 80 years of its existence, GBC has struggled to keep up pace with technological advancements. This has largely contributed to many of the challenges it is facing at the moment. I've seen that you've done some work concerning GBC. Can you share some of those with us and the way forward for a corporation such as the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation?
The Ghana Broadcasting Corporation is a national asset. It's our national heritage, and it's one of the most powerful voices that can basically lead the process of paradigm shifting change. So I'm a Ghanaian, like all of us are. I have a stake. You have a stake. We all as Ghanaians have a stake in the success of GBC. So my contribution or my thoughts, my aspiration is that Ghana, which became the first African country, right, to evolve the process of independence, which led eventually to the complete and total liberation of the continent, right, has the possibility, especially given that it is now the HQ for the African Free Trade Agreement, yeah, to lead the way in becoming the content hub for the continent. And GBC has a powerful infrastructure in place, more than any other private network in the country. From what I understand, the DTT process, a lot of it is being made possible because of the infrastructure, the masts that GBC already has. It's got the best technical reach in the country. I don't want to prosecute its problems because I think you do know, you work there. I just want to look at its potential. And the potential that I see, my vision, when I look at GBC, I see that building, that place opposite Plus 233, right? I see a 36-story building, right? Which is like CNN. I see a CNN type complex, right? Made for Africans by Africans. I see a content publishing hub. I see data servers at the trade fair sites. I see a whole digital ecosystem creating a new industry, generating about $3 billion a year into Ghana's economy. I see a $100 billion company producing content that will travel across Africa and the African diaspora markets. Because of the work I've done across Africa, this is not pie in the sky. The problems that GBC faces, Google, SABC, in one of, if not the most powerful economy in Africa, is facing the same problem. The Nigerian Television Authority is facing the same problem. Kenya Broadcasting Corporation is facing the same problem. Tanzania Broadcasting Corporation is facing the same problem. The only national broadcaster on the continent that is evolving with the essence of clarity and vision is in Ivory Coast. Check your facts, right? So the reason why I see GBC as powerful is because most things that have been essentially visionary and intellectual capital driven tend to emanate mostly from a number of African countries, including Ghana. And I'm Ghanaian, right? So I see a network, an African broadcast network, which is underpinned by the infrastructure of the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, which has the right management skills. And I think the current Director General of the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, who loves development communications and rural broadcasting, right, has the right vision and a very sound understanding of what the ordinary African needs.
You see, so you made mention of SABC, Kenya Broadcasting Corporation. You talked about the NTA, Nigeria, and so on. You didn't tell us about the BBC. You didn't tell us about the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and how successfully they are being run. And they are being run because there is a consistent, trustworthy source of funding for these public broadcasters. The others that you have mentioned who are struggling, just like GBC, just like SABC and the likes, do not have a consistent, trustworthy source of funding. That fundamentally is the problem, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't want to compare, but since you mentioned, let me take the BBC. Recently, Mark Thompson, who's a former Director General, and I believe now heading New York Times, gave a lecture about the power of the new digital ecosystem. BBC is a £3 billion per annum company, I think, deriving a significant part of its revenues from the license fee, right? It's independent of government intervention, but it's also has been in the scope and sphere of public interest television and broadcasting a pioneer across the world. In Africa, it's got the best footprints in terms of content, and its impact in terms of the sphere of radio is phenomenal. We all know that, right? However, the context of our television economy cannot be compared to the West. That's why I stay away from it, because television works well within the context of a thriving economy. Advertising revenues, for example, right? So you cannot isolate economic reality from the reality of television in terms of a guzzler of money. I believe the way forward, right, is policy at the international development level, looking at media as an effective tool for governance, looking at media as a bastion for accountability and responsibility. And Ghana is the one country on the African continent, according to, I think it is the Reporters Without Borders, right, World Press Freedom Index. Ghana is #1 in Africa, right, because the system which was put in place during the Fourth Republic, where the rights...
Currently, Ghana is not #1, that I can tell you. We're talking about the index, press freedom.
Yes.
Ghana fell to about number 4 or 5 after the killings of a journalist and the attacks on some other journalists in the country earlier this year.
Before this interview, Ghana is number 29 in the world, right? And it is #1 in Africa. There are 4 countries, right? The first country is Ghana. The second is Namibia, South Africa, and then Cape Verde. Those are the 4 countries in the list.
Currently?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
All right.
Just check. I mean, I wouldn't sit...
I'll check again.
Yeah, please do. Right. You're talking about... I don't want to talk politics,
yes,
etc. I just want to remain on the industry trail. But the reality, what I'm saying is that the people I work with within the Western world, my networks here, view Ghana in the right light. Recently, with the Rights to Information Acts, right? There's some journalists in Ghana, like Madam Elizabeth Ohini, who have set a standard that's respected around the world. Yeah. So Ghana, in terms of journalism, it's not perfect, but it's one of the most credible on the continent. And when you look at the way radio activists, partisan political stations, etc., vocally engage in the dialogue of change and issues here, nobody's being arrested, right? So we've got to give some credits to the due process of this Fourth Republic, right? And that needs to be enhanced. My commitment and my focus and what I passionately believe is that the private sector hasn't got enough resources. The public sector hasn't got enough resources. So there needs to be a considered, carefully weighted amalgamation. What will happen in the private sector is obvious. Most of the TV stations, I promise you, will have no revenues in 5 years from now.
Just 5 years?
Well, let's be considerate, because the pie, you see what makes advertising, there's the virtuous cycle of growth. In our economies, ask any advertising agency, fast-moving consumer goods usually is number one, with Unilever sitting on that page. Then you got the banks, right, who basically also do a lot of advertising. Then you got the telcos, right? So when you look at the advertising pie that's coming in, fundamentally, if you don't produce a robust feedback mechanism to the person spending the advertising dollars, right, they are not going to invest. So when you look at the ratio of growth in the advertising pie, let's look at Nigeria, Africa's largest population. It had in television a spend, right, which was like 800 million in 2017 US dollars. It's projected to grow to 1.2 billion in 2022. Look at South Africa. It commands 2.5 to 2.8 billion in television alone. So when you look at the television ecosystem, pay TV, who is doing well on the continent? The Naspers Group, which controls multi-choice, right? They got their market speculations and targeting rights. But when you look at the sphere of free-to-air broadcasting, those countries that are being carried along, in each of these, there are only 5 or 6 broadcasters, right, who are taking all the revenues, or 70% of the revenues. In Ghana, I'm sure UTV, because of the kind of programming they do, will be number one. They reach more people, because most people don't speak English, or English is not the first language, right? So as the economy becomes tight, and television is not cheap, right? Because of the intervention and necessity that you need a public interest system, a way has to be found to make GBC more efficient. Right, and I believe that where there's a will, there is a way.
Right, we're running out of time, so let me quickly ask you, and I was doing this, that you say that at ABN Holdings, you have what you call a vision to unleash the power of digital media as a force for change across Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, how can you achieve this when almost throughout the Sub-Saharan Africa, there is severe, and I've mentioned this already, lack of reliable energy supply? Basically, if you don't have the energy, you won't have the internet with which you can then rely on to do all the things that are done with technology. You can't even watch traditional TV consistently because power is off. You can't broadcast consistently because power is either off or too expensive.
That will change.
What will change?
The lack of energy will change, because the last continent on this planet, possibly the richest, right, which is least harnessed in terms of its resources, is Africa. Africa is a huge place and it is a rich continent. The energy crisis, right, will change, but let's be hopeful. Let's not look at things as they are, but what we want them to be, right? For people without vision perish. We don't want to perish. So let's hope and believe that energy, we have solar energy. It's just that it's very difficult commercialize it, right? Because you have to store the energy. But there'll be a way forward. There'll be a way forward. And as we anticipate that way, we've got to also think about how the industry, right, can match itself in terms of evolving and growing.
So for anybody watching us right now, particularly those who are within the media industry, who have been inspired by some of the things you've told us today, if they're wondering, so how soon is this grand idea going to take off so that we can all come together under an umbrella known as the African Broadcast Network? How soon are we going to see a concretization of these ideas?
I believe in the idea virus. It's not about how soon, but the inevitability of it. We all agree we need an African broadcast network. We need an African voice, right? So the idea virus concept is to put a lot of thought out there and provoke and engineer creative visionaries to find a way forward. I am hoping, right, that within the next 5 years, there'll be traction. But my vision is that by 2030, there'll be a well-funded, financially viable African broadcast network, which looks at the next 100 years of emancipated change.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been 1 hour of education. We've been speaking with Mr. George Twumasi. Mr. George Twumasi is the CEO of the ABN Holdings Limited, a company that hopes to bring together all African media players under one umbrella known as the African Broadcast Network, so that we can remodel the way that the media industry works to meet the demands of the time and to avoid the collapse of the media industry. Thank you very much for being a part of the show. We'll see you again tomorrow when we bring you another edition of Moomen Tonight. Until then, you have a very good night. Bye-bye.